Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at something incredibly powerful. We're unpacking part 3 of a profound 4-part sermon series titled Be Ye Transformed. This was delivered by Pastor Noel Sandesh, straight from the Crown of Life Ministries in Bhopal. Listen, if you've ever felt like your faith gets a little shaky when life hits you hard, or if you just sense there's a deeper dimension to your spiritual life that you aren't quite tapping into yet, you are in the right place. We're going to completely unpack the spiritual mechanics of moving way beyond surface-level religion to unlock something entirely different.
Here is our game plan for today. We'll start with the 2 levels of change, walk through the actual steps to change, crack open this fascinating concept called epignosis, lay out the 7 pillars of precise knowledge, and finally, we'll pit general belief against absolute, unshakable conviction.
All right, Section 1, 2 levels of change, where we'll explore the foundational premise in Romans 12:2.
So, Romans 12:2 challenges us not to conform, but to be transformed by renewing our minds, right? But how does that actually play out? Pastor Sandesh points out that there are 2 totally distinct levels of change here. First, you have personal transformation. This is the deep internal rewiring, your thoughts, your desires, the way you process ideas. It's the heavy inner work. But here's the beautiful part. It doesn't just stay stuck inside your head. Once that internal shift locks in, it acts like a domino effect, triggering environmental transformation. Suddenly, the external stuff, your relationships, your finances, your career, your marriage, it all begins to shift as a direct result of what just happened on the inside. It's a literal inside-out process.
Moving right along to Section 2, the steps to change in the actual process of spiritual growth.
So, knowing about these levels of change is great, but how do you pull the trigger on them? Pastor Sandesh lays out a very specific 3-step process. Step 1 is simple enough. You have to recognize you actually need transformation. Step 2 is getting access to superior spiritual information, basically getting deep into the Word. But honestly, this is where so many believers just hit a wall. They get the information, well, actually, let me rephrase that. They hoard the information, but they completely miss Step 3, which is building conviction. Having spiritual data in your head is just belief, and belief can absolutely be shaken. Conviction, on the other hand, that's bedrock. Which brings us to Section 3, Understanding Epignosis, the ultimate Greek key to transformation.
To really grasp how we build that bulletproof conviction, we have to look at the original Greek language from the New Testament. I want to throw a question right at you. If I asked, "Do you know God?" you'd probably say, "Yeah, of course I do." But let's dig a bit deeper. Do you just know about Him casually, or do you have highly specific, incredibly exact knowledge of who He is? There is a massive difference.
And that exact difference is captured perfectly by the word epignosis. This isn't your everyday Sunday school level of knowing. Epignosis represents an advanced level of spiritual transformation. It literally translates to super precise, intimate, exact knowledge of God. When you hit the level of epignosis, you're absolutely done just reciting memory verses. You are intimately and experientially acquainted with the very core of God's nature.
Let's unpack that in Section 4, the 7 pillars of precise knowledge. Think of this as the blueprint of epignosis.
Super precise knowledge sounds amazing in theory, right? But what does it practically look like? Pastor Sandesh makes it incredibly concrete by anchoring it to 7 scriptural pillars. To have epignosis, you need to know His thoughts, knowing from Isaiah that they are vastly higher than ours. You've got to know His plan, anchoring on Jeremiah 29:11, that He's setting you up for good, not disaster. You must deeply understand His character, His mercy. You need to know exactly what pleases Him, and just as crucially, exactly what displeases Him. You have to recognize His specific ways of doing things. And finally, you must comprehend His divine fatherhood, knowing deep in your bones that you're an adopted child crying out, "Abba, Father."
When you actually wrap your head and heart around these 7 pillars, the entire game changes. You elevate from just being a fan in the stands, knowing facts about God, to actually being on the field. You experience Him daily. You're no longer just observing. By understanding His thoughts and His ways, you become a totally active participant in His ultimate plan.
Now, think about this logically for a second. If you know someone perfectly, like, say, your absolute best friend or your spouse, is it even possible for someone to trick you into believing a lie about them? If someone came up and told you a totally out-of-character rumor about your best friend, you'd laugh in their face, right? Why? Because your precise knowledge of who they are instantly overrides any garbage information.
Pastor Sandesh uses this brilliant, playful little analogy in the sermon about a boy named Vision. Imagine someone walks right up to little Vision and says, "Hey, you're a girl." Does Vision burst into tears? Does he sprint to a mirror in an absolute panic to check if it's true? No way! It's an absurd lie. He knows his own identity so perfectly that the lie just bounces right off him. And listen, it is the exact same spiritual mechanic with God. When you possess epignosis, when those 7 pillars are locked in, Satan literally cannot deceive you. When your life turns upside down, you don't suddenly question God's goodness, because your precise knowledge of his character is an absolute fortress.
And that brings us perfectly to our final stop, Section 5, Belief versus Unshakable Conviction, which is the ultimate goal of all this transformation.
Here is the harsh reality for a lot of well-meaning believers. Without epignosis, your transformation is basically incomplete. You're operating on a general belief system, and the problem with general belief is that it is highly vulnerable when the storm hits. Trouble comes, and suddenly you're crying out, "Why is God doing this to me?" But true conviction born from epignosis, creates absolute, unshakable trust. It literally does not care what your external circumstances look like.
Look at the Apostle Paul. He is literally our ultimate case study for this. The guy is sitting in a miserable prison, suffering intensely, and what does he say in 2 Timothy? He says, "I am not ashamed, for I know him whom I have believed, and I am persuaded beyond any doubt." Catch that wording. He doesn't just say, "I believe him," he says, "I know him." He is intimately, precisely acquainted with God's character. His circumstances were terrible, but his conviction never flinched because he had epignosis. Paul wasn't just coasting on some blind, cross-your-fingers kind of faith. In Romans 8, he declares, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life will be able to separate us from the love of God." He was totally 100% convinced. Think about this transformation. He went from literally murdering the early church to being a guy whose faith couldn't be dented by beatings, prisons, or death sentences, because he understood the thoughts, the plan, and the fatherhood of God so completely, the world around him lost its power to dictate his spiritual state.
So, as we wrap up this explainer on Pastor Noel Sandesh's incredible message from the Crown of Life Ministries in Bhopal, I want to leave you with a really provocative question. Look at your own life. Are you resting on a fragile, surface-level belief system, or are you actively pursuing the epignosis that builds unshakable conviction? Part 3 of Be Transformed isn't about just trying harder to be a good person. It's about pursuing that precise, intimate, 7-pillared knowledge of God. So when the tough times inevitably roll in, are you going to need a mirror to remember who God is? Or will you already be persuaded beyond a shadow of a doubt? Pursue epignosis, guys. It literally changes everything.